Well, good morning, everybody. We are glad that you all are here for the Rector's Forum. And today we are blessed to have Dr. John Ragosta with us to talk about some really light issues. The First Amendment, the history of establishment in Virginia, Thomas Jefferson's role in disestablishment, and what the First Amendment means in our own time and how it's being interpreted and understood by the courts. John, let's start with kind of the background to understand how we ended up with a First Amendment to the Constitution. What was the religious situation in the colonies prior to the Revolution, but especially here in Virginia?
Well, it's a great question, Justin. Thank you all for coming, for having me. We've been told that people came to America for religious freedom. But as soon as they came here, it was always freedom to have the correct religion, whatever the government defined that religion as. So in Virginia, the Anglican Church, it's in the 1606 charter from James I. The Anglican Church is going to be the established church in the state of Virginia, in the colony of Virginia. And the other problem with our understanding is we've been told for years that, well, yes, Virginia had the Anglican Church, the Church of England, but it was a mild establishment. Edmund Randolph, for example, says it was a mild establishment. Well, of course, he's Anglican. So it was a mild establishment if you were Anglican. Yeah. But in Virginia, every person, every citizen is paying a tax to support the local parish, the local Anglican church. If you're Baptist, Presbyterian, Quaker, you're paying an Anglican tax. For most people, that is the largest tax they're paying. Everyone has to attend a church or a licensed meeting house one Sunday in 4, at least one Sunday in 4. Very few licensed meeting houses for Baptists or Presbyterians or other dissenters because they wouldn't license them. So you're basically being forced to go to the Anglican church. Yeah. And then what really would upset people, and you can imagine why, the Anglican vestry is controlling poor relief, it's controlling orphans, it's controlling, you can be indicted for swearing, for fornication. And they're doing this in a discriminatory manner. So if a Baptist couple died and had children, we're going to make sure those Baptist children are raised in a good Anglican home. So we're going to take those children out and put them, or if they're Presbyterian, we're going to put them into an Anglican home. So it was mild if you were an Anglican, but it became a serious problem for these dissenting religions.
And I imagine there was also a sort of socioeconomic dimension here, because I know vestries were very much controlled by a few wealthy agrarian families in Virginia, and they held on to that power tightly.
Absolutely. The power is in the Church of England. Yeah. So one historian, Bishop Meade, actually writes about this. He says in the 1776 convention that declares Virginia's independence, creates the Virginia Constitution, there were only 3 members who were not vestry members. So the vestry, the Anglican hierarchy, I mean, this is what we mean when we talk about church and state. This is why Jefferson was so upset about church and state. The church is supporting the state is supporting the religion. And it's wealthy. It's the Robert Carter Nicholases, the Randolphs, and so on.
Yeah, and one interesting dimension of this for the Church of England and then later the Episcopal Church is it also meant we never had a culture of real stewardship. It actually took a long time for us to cultivate that because we relied on the government's largesse. Right. So in some ways there were also, I don't think we realized it at the time, but some negatives to this situation for Anglicanism in the colonies.
Well, and for churches generally, and people talk about that when Jefferson and Madison and others, and as I've implied, the evangelical Baptists and Presbyterians became huge supporters of separating church and state because they had suffered under it. 30, 40, 50 years later, you had people who had been fighting that saying this is the best thing that ever happened to the church, getting the government out of it. Because they didn't know how to raise money, they didn't know how to support their ministers, they didn't know how to do outreach, they didn't know how to do the Great Commandment. And so they're learning that once you have a free market for religion.
Yeah, that's something I know that people point to as one of the reasons why Christianity is, at least historically, more vibrant in the United States than in Europe. So we've got this establishment, the Anglican Church here in the colonies, or I should say in Virginia. It's Congregationalists up north. But how does Jefferson fit into this? You mentioned him. He was upset about this. What role does he play in moving us to disestablishment?
It's a great question. I wonder how long I can go here.
In just a couple minutes.
You get the Great Awakening in the middle of the 18th century, which is occurring in England. It's occurring all over the colonies. It's this revival. And so you get an explosion of these dissenting religions in Virginia, and again, especially the Presbyterians and Baptists. And they go from virtually no dissenters in Virginia to, by the time of the American Revolution, the numbers aren't clear. I could explain why, but anywhere from 20% to 35% are dissenters. And so Jefferson and Madison, they're very much together on this, are watching this happening, and the Anglican establishment is watching it happening. And so they go from discrimination, telling people you have to pay a tax to support the Anglican Church, that's discrimination. Saying the vestry is going to control poor relief and orphans, that's discrimination. They go from discrimination to active persecution because they're growing. We got to keep these people down. They're hurting the church. And so in the run-up to the Revolution, you start arresting dissenting ministers for preaching without a license or disturbing the peace. There's instances where dissenting ministers are chased with foxhounds, and if anybody's ever been to a fox chase, that's not amusing, being chased with foxhounds. Rocks are being thrown. There's a case where they're not allowed to have church, dissenting meeting house. Someone throws a hornet's nest in during one of their meetings. Another instance, someone throws a snake in during one of the meetings. Historic record just says it's a snake. That's all we can tell from the historic record. I've been telling people it's a copperhead. I've been in Virginia a long time. They're throwing a copperhead into that. Wow. And so that persecution is what really brings in Madison first, because it was happening more in Orange County than in Albemarle County because of the demographics. But it's that persecution brings Madison and Jefferson in to say, this is wrong. Madison refers to it as a hell-conceived notion of persecution. And Jefferson comes around to the realization fairly early that if we're going to have a country, because we have people in this country who come from different ethnicities, different countries, different religions, we can't have the government taking sides on religion because people are going to be fighting all the time. Yeah. This is very relevant to the modern situation. And so Madison and Jefferson become, with the Baptists and the Presbyterians, major advocates of we've got to separate church and state.
And what did that mean for Madison and Jefferson? So, we use that phrase all the time, separation of church and state, a wall between church and state. What did that mean in their minds?
Oh, boy, it's complicated.
That's why you're here, to enlighten us.
They are grappling with it because they realize because of what they've lived through. And I tell people Jefferson has philosophical reasons. He's an Enlightenment philosopher, but he's also seen what's happening politically. The third thing that's motivating him, that's informing that question, I tell people, not a lot of historians I think have focused on this. I think he has theological reasons for church and state separation. The Baptists clearly had a theological reason. Jefferson is not a Christian in any normal sense of the term, but he is a theist. He believes in a God. And one of the critical things in the 18th century that the Baptists in particular were pushing, but the Presbyterians as well, is you have to have a personal relationship.
Right.
Unmediated. Right. No pope, no bishop, no government. Mm-hmm. And so Jefferson comes at this and Madison, from those three perspectives. So what does it mean? It means, in particular, government can't take sides. Madison and Jefferson say, when we people create government, we give government power, we give it authority, we give it a jurisdiction. we've never given it any authority on religion, because that's personal.
Right.
So government should not be involved in those decisions. Now, how you apply that becomes complicated. For example, Madison and Jefferson have an argument. Jefferson wants to forbid ministers from holding public office. And Madison and Jefferson actually argue about that. Madison says, well, no, wait a minute. We don't want to give religion any benefits because they're religion, but we also can't penalize somebody because they're religious. And Madison convinces Jefferson, no, that it's okay for a minister to hold office. The Reverend Jesse Jackson.
Yes, right, sure.
So they're trying to work that out, and a lot of the modern disputes are around this. How do we deal with that divide?
Yeah, and maybe this is a good opportunity to kind of get into the First Amendment. Obviously, there's going to be a disestablishment in the colony, in Virginia, and the state, and so forth. But for us today, probably the most important issue is the First Amendment and how it applies in concrete situations. So in general, it has two dimensions, right? It has the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. What is the First Amendment saying, building on what you've just said, but what do those two clauses mean?
Okay, so Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or forbidding the free exercise thereof.
Yeah.
And the courts have grappled with this because a lot of people say, well, they're inconsistent. The one is saying government, can't get involved, and the other is saying, but people get to do what they want, regardless of government, potentially. And so there's a potential tension. I don't think that Jefferson and Madison and the early people saw it as a tension. So Jefferson, for example, on the wall of separation, and there's going to be a wall of separation between church and state, but Jefferson always understood that there would be a vibrant religion on the other side, the private side of the wall. So as long as government doesn't get involved, we're going to it's none of our business if people want
We're not going to choose or favor or benefit one particular religion or religious perspective over another is sort of the key element, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so the term, the modern Supreme Court talks about neutrality. Jefferson talked about impartial. So the idea is we're not going to get involved. And by the way, the result, and you alluded to this a little bit earlier, one of the things that happens is it's because of this pulling government out of religion, disciples of Christ, right. Latter-day Saints, there's this explosion of religions in the early 19th century. Mormons and Oneidians and American Methodist Episcopal Church. Right. This is all because government's going to get out. So we're going to have a vibrant religion on that private side of the wall. Now, Jefferson's confused. He thinks they're all going to be Unitarian.
Right.
He says several times that America is going to adopt a rational religion. In another 20 years, everybody will be Unitarian. It doesn't happen. But
turns out maybe Jefferson didn't know everything.
No, Jefferson's not always a great predictor. But so it was this idea of we're not going to take sides, but we're going to certainly allow people to be on their private and public. And this is where some of the cases get difficult. Private doesn't mean non-public. It means non-governmental.
Right.
So the creche cases, for example, on government property, one of the famous cases was in Pittsburgh, and the court, I think quite properly, there was a creche scene for Christmas that was kept in one of the governmental buildings, and the court said, you can't do that, you've got to get out of there. Well, U.S. Steel, which was the biggest corporation in Pittsburgh, got the creche, bought it, had it donated to them, and put it on their front steps of the U.S. Steel building. Okay, that's not a problem. So it's not non-public, it's non-governmental.
Let's dig into this first element before we get to the free exercise dimension. Is it truly possible for the government to be neutral and impartial vis-a-vis religion? Let's think about the sort of moral values, religious values that at many periods in our history have had a significant impact on governmental policy, on public policy. If the government chooses a particular piece of legislation or a particular policy that seems to be rooted in a kind of Judeo-Christian value system, is that favoring that, or have they just simply persuaded the government that this is the best way to go? How does that work exactly?
There are going to be difficult cases. It's a great question, because there are going to be difficult cases. And everyone, and this, by the way, has caused a lot of the problems in the historic record, and the courts argue about this. Virtually everyone in the 18th century would agree that religion promotes morality and virtue. And virtually everyone in the 18th century would agree that for the country to work, we need moral and virtuous people. The disconnect comes, and Madison and Jefferson talk about this very specifically, but we don't think that the government's involvement encourages religion. We think that religion's going to do better. And again, I think history's demonstrated them correct, what happens at the Second Great Awakening in the 19th century. So the problem is, does government promote that virtue when it gets involved in religion? Because we want that virtue. We want that. So
whose virtue, right? I mean, that's the other question.
And Jefferson says, a response to that is, look, Jefferson studies comparative religion. He studies Judaism, he studies Islam, and he says, when I look around the world at all these religions, they share the same ethical requirements. You don't lie, you don't cheat, you don't steal, you don't kill people. They differ in dogmas, and Jefferson talks about oceans of blood have been spilled over these dogmas that don't matter. And so I think his answer to that question would be, sure, government laws are going to promote ethics, they're going to promote moral. You don't kill people. That's going to be a law. Why? Because we think it's wrong to kill people. But he would say that's not tied to any particular religion or sect. That's a human value.
So he's sort of operating with this kind of 19th century or 18th century notion that Enlightenment notion that there's sort of a universal moral ethic, a universal man, kind of behind it all, so to speak. What would he say to something like this, though? I mean, there are Christians that believe very clearly, based on, say, the Sermon on the Mount, that violence is impermissible for a virtuous group of Christians. Are those people, if they were ever successful, able to persuade the government to take a pacifistic stance? Obviously, that probably wouldn't work for a nation, but the point being, that's clearly not a universally shared value. So how would he have thought about that?
Again, they're going to be very difficult,
Yeah.
When you get down to the nitty-gritty.
Yeah.
But they actually grappled with this.
Okay.
So a question came up with the First Amendment, and when they were drafting the Bill of Rights, and Madison was more intimately involved, but as I said, I could talk about Madison and Jefferson are close on a lot of issues.
Yeah.
On this one, they're very, very close.
Okay.
And Madison says there's no need, because people were saying you need to put in the Bill of Rights that people can be pacifists and therefore avoid the draft. And Madison says, no, I don't view that as a universal concept. Congress can pass a law when they have a draft, and he advised they should. He said when they have a draft, Congress should pass a law and say, but we're not going to make pacifists serve. It's bad policy, it's bad, just bad policy. But he doesn't believe that would rise to the kind of
universal
have a right.
value or right.
But it's a great example because you're getting difficult.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like part of their thinking was premised on a particular notion of morality, which may be true, but it may not be true. It may be that different communities actually do have fundamentally or significantly different moral visions.
Right. This one of the reasons, and I've been fascinated by this, and I don't have a good answer to this. The whole idea in Western thinking, especially Christian thinking, of separation, it goes back to Augustine, city of God, city of man, and it continues. From an Eastern perspective, or a Native American perspective, there's no separating spirituality from your, everything's spiritual. You've got animism, the woods have a spirit, humans have a spirit. And so I've actually talked with people from an Eastern perspective about does the whole idea of a separation of church and state even make sense from an Eastern perspective?
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Let's jump to the second part of the First Amendment. So the free exercise clause. The government can't restrict our exercise of our religious life. Well, wait a second. Does that mean that if I say something is part of my religion, since of course they can't decide what religion is or isn't, that I can just do that and the government can't restrict me? But
Get out of jail free.
How does that work?
And again, it's remarkable how many of these things they dealt with. Jefferson actually deals with this at some length in Notes in Virginia. And he gives the obvious example, but I think people jump over the example too quickly. He says, look, what if your religion tells you to have child sacrifice?
Right.
And so they say, well, that's my religion, so I get out. And no one is going to support that. And which, on a principled basis, by the way, what we're talking about, I tell people, we're talking about gay wedding cakes here.
Right.
We're talking about, so if I got a law saying you can't discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation, and somebody says, but I'm not going to serve that person because they're gay, do I get to use my religion as an exception? But Jefferson gives a second example, which I think goes exactly to gay wedding cakes. He says, okay, what about if there's a war going on, and we pass a law that says you can't slaughter a lamb because we want that lamb to grow up so we can get wool for uniforms for our soldiers. And he's clearly thinking of Passover.
Yeah.
He says, so the law says you cannot slaughter a lamb. Can you slaughter the lamb and say my religion required me to do this? And he says, no. But, and this is the important, he said, but it has to be an impartial law. So if the law says you can't slaughter a lamb for religious purposes, that's not impartial. You know, it's a religious, that's a violation of the Establishment Clause.
Right.
If the law says Jews cannot slaughter lambs, that's not impartial.
Okay.
But if it's an impartial law, Jefferson, and he's pretty clear about this, as is Madison, no, you get no get out of jail free card. The Congress, the legislature, it's their job as our representatives to decide where that line is.
Yeah.
But there's no religious freedom right to do what you want.
Right. So the government can restrict what you do as part of your religion. It just can't make those restrictions targeted towards particular groups.
Right. And you said a critical word. If you read the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which it's a wonderful document, it's worth reading. Jefferson says several times, difference between actions and beliefs.
Yeah.
Government can never penalize you for a belief. But if you take an action that disturbs the good order of society, that's what government does.
Yeah. All right. So we've got these two dimensions to the First Amendment. One aspect I think we haven't talked about, it's probably worth mentioning, is that the First Amendment, as you noted, mentions Congress, right? So Congress shall not do. So states were not, for a while at least, not under that restriction, right? How did it come about that states had to be following the First Amendment as well?
Well, that's great, and it's important. It's after the Civil War.
Okay.
Obviously, we're going to make the states, and it's taken a while after the Civil War to fully implement that, but the states are going to be bound because of the 14th Amendment, due process, equal protection, privileges and immunities of citizenship have to be applied by the states. But what's interesting from a historic perspective is the only reason we get the First Amendment and separation of church and state is because the states weren't bound. At the time, Virginia is really the only state that has what we would think of as separation of church and state. Even in Pennsylvania and Rhode Island, which are quite liberal, there are still restrictions. If you want to hold government office, you have to swear an oath on a Bible, you have to believe in the Old and New Testament. Massachusetts has a religious establishment till 1836. New Hampshire has a religious establishment. Established church, you're paying taxes. So when Madison's trying to get the First Amendment through, he would have never been able to do it, except that a lot of people were saying, look, if you want to do that to the federal government, that's good. We don't like the federal government anyway. Let's so putting bans, tying the federal government down, that's fine, as long as the states get to do what they want to do. So and I worked in Washington for 20 years. How do you get an alliance to get an amendment through Congress and then adopted by the states? Well, you have to get all those different groups that have different interests Madison, of course, talks about this in Federalist Number 10, to come together. And one of the critical things was, especially the Congregationalists in New England, they had no intention of stopping, they had no intention of separating church from state. You can do it with the federal government. Now then what happens over the next 50, 60, 70 years is all of the states, and this is actually was the focus of my second book, was what happens. And what I find is everybody over that 60, 70 years moves in a Jeffersonian direction. You see every one of the states, we think of the Constitutional Convention, but keep in mind states are having constitutional conventions all the time, every 5, 10, 20 years. And every one of the constitutional conventions between when the First Amendment is adopted and the Civil War, they are changing their constitutional provisions on religious freedom, and they're all moving in a Jeffersonian direction. Some of them, Rhode Island takes the language from the Virginia Statute and puts it in its constitution. North Carolina, they're having their constitutional debates, and people are standing up reading the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom into the record, word for word. So, by the way, it's, takes you 5, 10 minutes to read it. They're reading that into the record and saying, this is the wisdom of Jefferson. We need to adopt that wisdom.
Clearly, Virginia's the best. Leading the way there. Okay, so how has, in recent years, how has the First Amendment been understood by our court system, and especially the Supreme Court? What things are they kind of restricting and saying, this really is a violation of the First Amendment? And what things that are kind of on the edge are they starting to allow, or have they been allowing for a good amount of time? Where do you see sort of like the conflict points there?
Let me take half a step back as to what changes, by the way. And I was talking to this about when Paul and I were talking to this up. Some people may have thought, as we had in this conversation, wait a minute, the evangelical Baptists and Presbyterians were strong advocates of separation of church and state? That doesn't sound right today. And that continues up through the middle of the 20th century. Strong advocates of strict separation. Well, what changes? Brown versus Board of Education. So that Jerry Falwell Sr. was a strong advocate of strict separation of church and state. We've got to keep government out of religion. After Brown versus Board of Education, and hundreds of lily white academies are opening up throughout the South, we suddenly want government to give us money to help run our little Christian white schools. And so Jerry Falwell does a 180 and says we've got to get government involved. You then get the Bible reading cases in the early 1960s. And so what those two things do is they change the entire dynamic. Up to that point in time, the court would look, what did Jefferson say? What did Jefferson say? What did Jefferson say? And today, Thomas would actively say, we don't need separation of church and state. He, by the way, relies on some really bad history in making his argument. So this change occurs. Now, where do we see it? I think the problem of exceptions is a huge one. I mean, that's coming up over and over again. I mentioned gay wedding cakes, but it comes up in many, many circumstances. Do I get to say I'm not going to abide by that? We could talk some more about that. And then the critical
Which is, by the way, the same thing that people said during the civil rights period, that their religion allowed them to segregate and so forth, and this law was unconstitutional because it wanted them to integrate.
Right, and let's stop there for a moment, because again, I think this is one that people are missing, and it's important. People discriminated against African Americans, saying they have the curse of Ham. Right. My religion tells me that they are not full humans, they are not going to get full privileges. And you had that going on at Bob Jones University. That's why Bob Jones University would not allow interracial dating. You had that going on for years, and it's still going on. There was it was either Mississippi or Louisiana, I forget. You take your pick. Recently, like 2 years ago, a woman owned a wedding venue, and a couple wanted to have a wedding there, and they were a mixed race couple, and she refused. Interestingly, her minister intervened and explained to her, you can't do this, and she changed her mind. But so these exceptions are extremely important. The other issue, which is what was motivating Jerry Falwell Sr. when he flipped, is funding. How does government fund religion, directly or indirectly? So school voucher programs in particular. And those are difficult cases. So the first big school voucher case was in Cleveland. And what the court eventually did is they said, look, nobody is saying that this money has to go to a religious school. It's going to any school. And so we're going to be neutral. The fact that some of that money is going to religious schools, that's fine. What is buried in that case was that 88% of the money was going to Catholic schools in Cleveland. Because that's why it was set up. The program was set up to help the Catholic schools because that's what they wanted to do in Cleveland at the time. And so these funding cases, we were talking beforehand, the case in Oklahoma, where they're creating a Catholic charter school. And it's a Catholic school. It's going to be Catholic priests and nuns, and they're going to be, doing Catholic doctrine. And the it's government money. It's your tax dollars are funding that. And what people were arguing is, but as long as we're neutral, we'd set up, if there was a Jewish school, we'd set up a Jewish. Now, of course, nobody's going to set up an Islamic charter school in Oklahoma. Right. It ain't going to happen. So isn't it convenient that it just happens to be a Catholic school? But you can see where some of these modern cases get this question of neutrality and the question of exceptions, I think, are the crucial. And then I suppose a third one is the court has said government cannot coerce people into supporting religion. And Scalia, Thomas, Kavanaugh, Alito have said, well, coercion has to be either physical or financial. So we can't tell you have to pay a tax to support religion. With coercion has to be physical or financial. That means the government could pass a law that says every government building must have a Star of David prominently displayed above the door. Every government piece of paper must have a Islamic crescent on it. We're not coercing anybody. Jefferson actually was very clear. He talks about this. He said, no. If you're coercing people in public opinion, if you're saying these are good, this is bad, these are the good citizens, they're going to church on Sunday, Jefferson says, no, that's coercion.
I wonder, though, if, John, to some degree, the government has always, in various ways, been putting its thumb on the scale. Let me just give you one example. Of course, I'm sure very well. I'm a, quote, minister of the gospel, unquote, according to the tax code, which means that every year I get to deduct a housing allowance from my taxable income. So whatever I spend on my house, could be mortgage payments, renovations, a benefit that you are not entitled to, but I am. I get to reduce my taxable income quite significantly, as you think housing expenses are a big expense. My understanding, this goes back decades, I think maybe even to like the 50s or 60s, seems like the government is supporting religion there. Now, maybe they're supporting all religions, I suppose, but it is clearly giving me a benefit that you're not getting.
Right. Now, by the way, to be clear, with Thomas, Alito, and Kavanaugh, they're saying it's okay for government to support religion as long as it does all religions.
Yeah.
We
right.
I got that. I thought where you're going to go is charitable deductions. Why is it?
Well, that too,
churches aren't taxed? And the answer to that is because it applies to all charities. It doesn't apply to, we're neutral, right? It's back to this problem of neutrality.
Right.
Now, do the churches get more of a benefit from that? What would Jefferson and Madison say? And personally, I have no problem with the idea of charities don't pay taxes. The problem comes in how these things are enforced, and we'll come back to the mortgage. How these things are enforced. So, for example, one of the things the IRS says with charities getting not paying taxes is they can't engage in political activity directly. Well, what's happened in the last 10, 15 years, really since Trump's first administration, is the IRS has said actively, we will not enforce that against churches. And so churches are actively engaging in political activity in a way that clearly violates the IRS regulations and I would say clearly violates separation of church and states. You're saying if Red Cross, if the Soros charity engaged in politics in that way, you would complain and say they're going to lose their charitable deduction. We're not doing that to churches.
Let me ask you a quick clarification on that, because what I had always been taught was that you're not allowed to endorse a party or a candidate, but I mean, you can engage in whatever political means. You can engage in kind of activism and moral persuasion. Is that right?
Sure,
okay,
absolutely.
Okay, yeah.
And so again, sometimes there's going to be a tough line.
Yeah.
But what's happening now is pretty blatant.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
you've got church ministers from the pulpit endorsing candidates, saying you should vote for this candidate, that candidate.
Which seems like a clear violation of the law.
From my perspective, clear violation. And the Trump administration said, we're just not going to enforce. Well, that means you don't have a regulation.
Right.
The mortgage deduction is more difficult.
Yeah, what do you think about that? I'm curious.
I would have problems with the mortgage deduction. But it's not unlike the case in Washington State. One of the big cases back in the 60s or 70s was there was a government scholarship program. And a young man, Davey, it was Washington versus Davey, wanted to use his scholarship to study for the ministry. And the state came in and said, no, you can't do that.
Interesting.
And so that became one of the early cases. And it gets back to this neutrality. Is it wrong because government is establishing, we have government tax dollars going to train this young man for the ministry? Or is it, wait a minute, we'll give government tax dollars to train you to be a dentist or train you to be an accountant. We're not going to discriminate.
Yeah.
And, I have no problem with the neutrality principle. I do have, I wrote about the Cleveland case that I'd mentioned. 88% of that money was going to Catholic schools.
Right.
That was not neutral.
Right.
Well, what's it take? 50%, 60%,
Yeah, I mean, that's the tricky thing, right, John, is that what is religion? How do you define it? And so if you want to distinguish between things that are religion and non-religion, and have that be your criterion, well, it gets really tricky then. I'm not even sure I could do that.
No, and that's a very important point. I'm glad you raised it. The court has always been very clear, and I think rightfully, but just because I haven't been smart enough to think of another alternative, the court says, we are not going to tell you what your religion is.
Right.
So if somebody comes in and says, my religion tells me I can't bake a gay wedding cake, I'm not going to theologically say, no, your religion doesn't tell you that. If somebody comes in and says, my religion tells me I'm not going to let an interracial couple get married at my wedding venue, and I think this is wise, because again, I don't know how else you would do it.
Yeah.
But so once the court is saying, we cannot tell you what your religion is, and by the way, this goes back where the court really said it was draft evasion.
Right.
Back in the 60s, when people were trying not to go to Vietnam, and said, we're not going to tell you, I have a deeply held religious conviction, because the Defense Department was trying to say, well, unless you're a Quaker or a Mennonite, we're not going to buy that. And the court says, wait a minute, we have a real concern with us telling you what your religion tells you to do. So that creates a lot of problems.
It does.
That's why these exception cases and these neutrality cases become so difficult, because it's easy for me to say, or a minister to say, that's not Christianity. Right. That curse of Ham, no, that's not Christianity. The courts can't do that.
Right. And judges aren't theologians either, so they're not really equipped to even enter into this complicated subject. Well, let's open it, John. We've covered a lot of ground. Let's open it up to questions. What questions do you have for John? About church and state? Yes.
Where did Patrick Henry stand?
Isn't today a big day for Patrick Henry too?
It's Patrick Henry Day. Today is the 250th anniversary of the "Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death" speech. I've been talking with people all week about Patrick Henry, because that's my current book. It's a very good question. Most of the I would say almost everyone at that time, if you'd ask them, do you support religious freedom? They'd say, of course I support religious freedom. What do you mean by religious freedom? Henry had defended some of the Baptist ministers who had been being jailed. So Henry realized, I had mentioned, 50% of I think I had mentioned 50% of the Baptist ministers in Virginia go to jail before the American Revolution for preaching without a license or disturbing the peace. Patrick Henry actually defended some of them in court. And so he understood this idea of government is going to pick Church of England, Baptist, whatever it's going to pick. You can't do that. But after the Revolution in 1784, when they're still trying to figure out, okay, so what do we do? Henry supports a proposal that said, okay, we're going to have a tax on everybody to support religion, but it's going to be fair. We'll say, okay, well, Gray, who do you want your tax to go to? Presbyterians, Methodists, who do you want your
like they do in Germany today?
And we'll spread out. Yeah. That's fair, right? Yeah. And by the way, only Christian religions. And by the way, this is what Thomas and so on would be saying. We were talking about this earlier. As long as you support all religion, it's okay. Well, what do you mean by all religion? Does it cover people who believe in the force? Does it cover Pastafarians? If you're going to tell me you can't tell me what your religion is...
Pastafarian, that sounds interesting.
The flying spaghetti monster. So Henry comes out in support of that bill that says it's okay to have government tax people to support religion, as long as it's neutral, as long as it's applying to everybody. Now, again, that particular law said Christian. Would Henry, if he'd, I don't know, I don't have him here to ask, would he have said, gee, it should apply to Jews as well? I suppose. But this is really important historically, because it was that bill that Jefferson and Madison opposed. Jefferson's actually in France drinking fine wine, but Madison leads the opposition to that, saying, no, that's too restrictive. The government cannot use tax dollars to support religion, even if it's going to be all religion. And that the Baptists and the Presbyterians, the evangelicals, support Madison, and that's what leads to the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. So you get this proposal for tax to support all religions, all Christian religions, and at that time, there's not a lot of, non-Christians in Virginia, or at least they were not thinking about the enslaved community. There's a lot of enslaved community that's actually Islamic. And that is rejected in favor of the Virginia Statute for Establishing Religious Freedom, pretty clear separation of church and state. So what Thomas and Kavanaugh and Alito are talking about is, no, we had that debate. It lost. And you get the Virginia Statute and you get the First Amendment after it.
Interesting. Yeah, Gene.
In the early days before the Revolution, you mentioned several states that had establishment. Did all the colonies have establishment, or were there exceptions?
It's a more difficult question than you would think. I say, and I think you can show, all states had some form of establishment. There were many states that did not have the classic, we're going to tax all of you to give money. So Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, you're all paying taxes to support the Congregational Church. Virginia, South Carolina, you're all paying taxes to support the Anglican Church. Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, which is we think of as the most religious freedom cases, there's Roger Williams, William Penn. Even there were still some restrictions. As I mentioned, a lot of them would have a restriction on holding public office. You have to say, I believe in the Old and the New Testament to hold public office. Keep in mind, this has been messy. There's a law on the books in Maryland until 1961 that says you have to swear Old and New Testament to hold public office. The Supreme Court strikes it down, but it's not till 1961. Wow. So they all have some forms of restriction. The kind of, you pay tax dollars to support the church, especially New England.
All right, thank you. What other question do you have for John?
This is also easy and
it's
also clear.
They've solved it all. Yeah. Nothing else? Yes, great.
Was there an inflection point in 1954 when Johnson's amendment was introduced to limit 501c3 groups from trying to influence politics? Was he just ratifying that amendment, something was already in place, or was it, what was the trigger? I don't know the history. Was it a trigger to ease up from pressure he may or may not have been getting?
I agree. It's a very good question. So how does this tax, model change with charities and so on? I don't know. Is the simple answer. I do know the idea of a charitable deduction goes back into the 19th century. The idea that charities are not going to be subject to taxes. But it was never, well, I shouldn't say never. The idea that it has to apply to all charities is of long standing. Where does it start and how does that inflection occur? I don't know.
Interesting.
I don't know.
All right, let's do one more question. Yes.
The cross in Maryland, the
Bladensburg Cross.
My understanding of that is part of the reason it's not an Establishment Clause violation is by virtue of the duration of time.
Yeah.
Can you explain, how does that play into the analysis?
It's a great question. So the Bladensburg Cross, there's this huge cross, 75 feet tall or something like that, to honor the World War I veterans. And it's on government land. It was put up in government land. Well, people sued and said, that can't be on government land. Now, by the way, there was a similar case out in California, and what they did, which was fine by me, they just gave the land to some private corporation, which is going to be responsible for keeping the cross. That's fine. No problem with public religion, as long as it's not government. And the argument was, the first argument was, well, we're not really supporting this because it's already there. And the plaintiffs pointed out, I think fairly, no. You got government people mowing the lawn, you got government people keeping the paint up, we're spending tax dollars to support this. So the court ultimately, as this may imply, the court said it's okay. We're going to leave the Bladensburg Cross. That opinion's led by Thomas and Kavanaugh and Alito, these conservatives. And what they said was, well, if history tells us that the early founders would have not had a problem with this, we're going to say that's not a violation. And there's been crosses on public land for years and cemeteries and so on, so we're just not going to have a problem with this. Now, I think some very bad history went into that, number one. And number two, for example, and this is one of the cases everybody points to, their real precedent was the chaplain case. Because wait a minute, House of Representatives has a chaplain, and they pay those people. So aren't we using government tax dollars? That goes back to 1791, when you got a House of Representatives chaplain. At the time, Madison says this violates the Constitution. He says if you want to have a government chaplain, people should pay for it themselves. Let the members of Congress take money out of their own pockets. They shouldn't be using tax dollars to support this. And he says, but getting back into it, he says, this is a minor, rather technical issue. We shouldn't let this kind of, I forget exactly his phrase, this kind of minor technical issue to change our understanding of the principle.
Sounds like slippery slope to me.
It is a little bit, but it's, so I think a Madison Jeffersonian perspective would say, no, you shouldn't have that cross there. They would also probably say the court should not come in when the court, oh yeas, God save this honorable court. The court back in the 60s came up with the phrase, I think it was the 60s, ceremonial deism. Yeah, just sort of a generic recognition that we're a religious people and there's a God out there, maybe.
Kind of civic religion.
Religion. So anyway, the Bladensburg Cross, now the real problem with this history is how far is this going to go? And because certainly historically, Bible reading in schools, sure. So is Thomas and Alito going to next say, well, historically, we had Bible reading in schools, so we're going to strike down the Bible reading in prayer cases. So, again, the Bladensburg Cross, it's hard to get too upset. You got a 75-year-old cross that's been sitting there for actually, it's now 100 years old. It's been sitting there since right after World War I to honor the vets, but it is a potential slippery slope.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, John, for being with us and for this stimulating conversation. Let's give him a round of applause. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.